Good day. It is a pleasure to present to the Digital Past Conference, especially as Welsh history was a key piece that nudged me to work in cultural heritage. My undergraduate degree specialization was in early medieval Europe, and one of my favorite readings was Gadwraeth, which showed me how important preservation of a single text can be to the historical record, how the manuscript tradition influences our interpretation, and how much we can learn about a culture through careful analysis of limited information. It made me want to work to ensure that some amount of our cultural heritage remains available for societies of the future. However, now, like the Godovan, we too find ourselves in battle with our heritage at risk. Although instead of fighting one group against another, we fight for the survival and well-being of all. The great increases in our technologies, energy sources, and population over the past several centuries has resulted in our domination of the planet. Our daily actions and interactions are truly global in scope. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reveals the grim reality of our cumulative impact. Its 2018 special report states that to avoid or have only limited overshoot of 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming, we must reduce global emissions of carbon dioxide by at least 45% by 2030, continue to net zero by 2050, and then advance to substantial negative net emissions for the remainder of the century. We need to remember that these figures are what we must achieve on a global average. Those of us in developed, wealthy, privileged nations who have done the most to cause the climate crisis have a moral obligation to reduce our emissions more quickly and to fund reductions in developing nations to limit the effects on the poor, disadvantaged, and vulnerable, who have done comparatively nothing to cause the crisis, but suffer its effects the most. However, the climate crisis is only our most notable environmental impact. We are also in the midst of a series of concurrent crises: plastic, particulate, noise, and light pollution, chemical toxicity in our land, air, and water, ocean acidification, habitat degradation and destruction, soil depletion, and biodiversity and biomass loss. Let us turn now to digital preservation's contribution to these crises. When I talk about digital preservation, I am talking about activities related to digital materials from acquisition or digitization through to preservation and access. Some may term this work digital stewardship. When we look at the now famous three-legged stool for digital preservation, the technology leg relies on information and communication technology, or ICT. Examining the full life cycle of ICT components, we realize that it is not only our electricity use to power and cool centralized data centers, local storage and computing infrastructure, and staff and end user devices, but also the material intensity of ICT that contributes to our environmental crises. ICT components require a wide range of materials, from specialized plastics to common and precious metals, all of which have impacts throughout their life cycles, from raw material extraction, refining, and manufacturing to shipping, use, and end-of-life disposal. With our current industry standard infrastructure refresh cycles, we incur these costs and impacts every 3 to 5 years. While it is difficult to quantify precisely digital preservation's environmental impact, scientifically rigorous and peer-reviewed works document the impact of ICT, and our use of ICT therefore imparts ownership of a portion of those impacts to our practices. Yes, the portion is small, but our digital preservation activities are growing quickly, and our standard practices, such as fully redundant replication and frequent fixity checking, expand both the magnitude and intensity of our ICT use. Also, when we assess digital preservation's environmental impact, we need to avoid the trap of relativism. Just because our practices contribute a relatively small amount to our unsustainability crises does not mean that we should ignore the impact. We have ownership of these actions, and we should take ownership of the impacts as well. We can reduce the negative impacts of our work while continuing to achieve our organizational missions, and our professional efforts do not preclude us from making personal efforts to move other aspects of society toward sustainability. So our daily activities, including our digital preservation practices, contribute to the interwoven environmental crises that, if we do not take action now, will together lead to a singular result: an extinction crisis for us and for nearly all flora and fauna on Earth. We are quite literally in a fight for our lives, but we cannot succumb to despair or inaction. As Bethany Nowitzki stated in her keynote address to the Rare Books and Manuscripts Section 2019 annual meeting, quote, "It remains absolutely vital that we honor our attachments and acknowledge the complexity and deep reality of our emotional responses to living through the sixth great mass extinction of life on this planet. Vital to compassionate teaching and leadership, to responsible stewardship, and to defining value systems that help us become more humane in the face of problems of inhuman scale." Unquote. We must take the time to acknowledge our emotions, to grieve for what we have already lost and what we know we will lose, and then let us come together to make true global sustainability our new reality. The first step we need to take is to understand why we face these environmental crises. Looking beyond resource use and waste streams, beyond the greed of a few, we need to understand the societal structures that cause us to persist in this behavior. What is it that keeps us burning fossil fuels, extracting resources, and dumping our wastes around the world, even though we know the deep injustice that the benefits of these actions accrue primarily to the wealthy and white, while the burdens are borne disproportionately by the poor, vulnerable, Black, Indigenous, and people of color? David Roberts, a journalist for Vox, offers another perspective. In an August 12, 2020 article titled "Air Pollution is Much Worse Than We Thought," he reports on the devastating toll of air pollution, primarily from the fossil fuel life cycle, and notes that current clean energy technologies can eliminate air pollution at a cost well below the net social benefits. When it is technologically feasible and less costly to switch to clean energy, our continuation of a largely business as usual consumption of fossil fuels is, therefore, a choice, he argues. And, quote, "When suffering on this scale, that is this brutally inequitable, becomes a choice, it enters the same ethical terrain as war, slavery, and genocide. The effects are more distributed over time and geography, as are the decision-making and the moral culpability, but the cumulative impact on human well-being, on our longevity, health, learning, and happiness is comparable and every bit as much worth fighting." Unquote. The driving force behind our persistent use of fossil fuels and our insatiable desire for resources is the economy, or rather, it is two key aspects of our economic models in combination. First, the notion that to be healthy, an economy must have continual increases in measurable activity. That is, an economy is only healthy when it is growing. And second, the disregard our economic models have for the environment and public health and well-being. Our economic structures and their reliance on continued growth are divorced from the realities of our physical world. They rarely, if ever, take into account the damages of raw material extraction or intensive agriculture, the health costs of pollution, or the value of ecosystem services. We simply cannot have continued growth in a constrained world. However, we then build structures around the economic growth narrative that correlate nearly all aspects of our lives to economic growth or its lack. Our employment and salary or wages, the price of housing, food, transportation, and other goods and services, our retirement, pensions, savings, and investments. We have tied all of these not to the stability of our economies, but to their growth. By integrating so many critical aspects of our lives with the economy, we have the highest of short-term incentives, being able to feed, clothe, and shelter our families and ourselves, to prioritize economic growth over the health of the planet. This is why even when our economic structures are working as intended, or perhaps especially when working as intended, our daily actions result in environmental harm. This brings us to the more deep-rooted reason we persist in our rampant use of resources. We have become ensnared in the demand side of the economic machine. Continual economic growth requires increasing consumption of goods and services. Whether it is finding new markets or increasing demand from existing ones, marketers have become ever more sophisticated in their messaging that encourages us to consume more. While more nuanced than this, the message is essentially that more is better, that through consumption we can improve satisfaction with nearly every aspect of our lives. And we absolutely can improve satisfaction through consumption, but only up to a point. Multiple studies have shown that after a certain level, which varies by geography and culture, income and consumption do not correlate to satisfaction, and correlation with well-being is even more tenuous. In his book, Deep Economy, Bill McKibben states that while economic activity should provide satisfaction for the participants, it appears to be doing the opposite. He argues that countries that have replaced community support, local economies, and national social programs with individual incomes in a global economy are seeing declining levels of life satisfaction even as income and consumption levels remain high or increase. When we connect our economic structures that require growth and our attempts to achieve satisfaction through consumption, it becomes clear why we are in a series of ecological crises. We have tied our well-being to how many resources we can consume within a system that is not grounded in the physical limits of our planet. Nearly every action we take to participate in this structure, to attempt to improve our satisfaction, has a negative impact on our planet and, as McKibben argues, potentially ironically on our satisfaction as well. We may be seeing a similar effect in digital preservation. In their recent article, What's Wrong with Digital Stewardship, Blumenthal, Greisinger, Kim, Peltzman, and Steves report on conclusions they reached from conducting qualitative interviews as a follow-up to the 2012 and 2017 National Digital Stewardship Alliance, NDSA, staffing surveys. They call out 7 primary themes that lead to digital stewardship dissatisfaction among practitioners, several of which appear to have a common and root cause: the grounding of our work in leadership and organizational structures that mirror our economic system and focus on short-term gain and innovation at the expense of maintenance and ongoing preservation and access. Blumenthal and co-authors make a similar observation in their article, and during a presentation at NDSA DigiPres 2020, Greisinger questioned whether digital preservation can flourish under a capitalist model. They write, quote, "Digital preservation is a maintenance-heavy undertaking that does not necessarily lend itself to the types of bureaucratic performance indicators which often sway decision-making and funding priorities. Unquote. We tend to force an alignment of our work with these performance indicators, measuring the success of our programs and projects by how much we acquire or preserve, instead of measuring how well we meet our community's needs. This moves our work from one of maintenance and care of digital materials that preserves their value and usefulness to one of acquisition and consumption that equates growth in the amount of digital materials we steward with successful outcomes for our communities." So how do we break out of this cycle? How do we reconnect with the constraints of our resource-limited world to reach a sustainable, satisfying future, both in general and for digital preservation in particular? We can look to sustainability leaders such as McKibben and John Ehrenfeld, who argue that to address the structural, fundamental unsustainability of our system, we need to make structural, fundamental, and active changes, not incremental, marginal, or passive ones. That is, we cannot rely on new technologies or incremental efficiency gains on their own, what Ehrenfeld calls reducing unsustainability. He argues that what we need is a paradigm shift, where we assess our goals and find fundamentally different ways of achieving them. This is how we can enact what he calls creating sustainability. For example, if we were to install a new, more efficient natural gas-powered heating system, or drive a more efficient or even electric personal vehicle, we are only reducing the unsustainability of how we meet our goals of heating our homes and transporting ourselves. To enact the paradigm shift, to create sustainability in achieving these goals, we can shift to renewably powered heat pumps to capture and move heat instead of creating it through fossil fuel combustion. And we can take public transit or car shares, carpool, or telecommute in place of personal vehicles. Simply put, McKibben and Ehrenfeld argue that the key is to stop our pursuit of satisfaction through consumption, and replace it with new ways of achieving life satisfaction. When we instead seek satisfaction through community, through personal relationships, through meaningful work, through enjoyment of the natural world, we not only improve our well-being and that of those around us, we also drastically reduce our environmental impact. We can apply Ehrenfeld's paradigm shift framework to digital preservation. Instead of measuring our professional success based on how much we acquire and preserve, let us shift to measuring it based on how well we support our communities. Our digital preservation efforts span short, medium, and long-term goals and seek to meet our community's needs over these timeframes. When we collect for the future without regard for the environmental impact, we undermine our very purpose by contributing to climate realities that will radically destabilize the society we hope to serve. Therefore, let us add environmental sustainability as a third, co-equal pillar of digital preservation practice alongside digital object management and successful use. Balancing these three areas gives us the best chance of meeting communities' needs now and in the future. This begins with appraisal. We should be selective in our appraisal of digital materials for potential acquisition. This is the most consequential decision that we can make in terms of sustainability because it determines how much data we steward through the remainder of our workflows. It is worth reiterating that we can conduct selective appraisal and still build collections that reflect the diversity, achievements, and shortcomings of our society. Let us return to Egodothan for a moment. As I mentioned in my opening, it provides an example of our ability to interpret our history through limited sources. The verses in Egodothan, what amounts to only kilobytes of text, reveal aspects of the warrior ethos of the Godothan. We can understand the reciprocal obligation of rulers and warriors, symbolized by the warriors' consumption of their rulers' wine or mead, which they repay in battle. We see the segmentation of social life in the expectation that warriors are ferocious at war, while gentle and generous at home. And we get a sense of the Godothan psyche in their belief that valor in battle can lead to a glorious death worthy of remembrance. This shows how even with limited historical sources, our interpretations and understanding can be rich and complex. The skills honed in fields such as early medieval history and archaeology that routinely deal with the interpretation of scarce information can inform our modern acquisition and selective appraisal practices so that we better understand what information is truly critical for our communities. We can best implement selective appraisal by engaging more deeply across job functions so that curators, preservation specialists, and public services all have a better understanding of the costs of preservation, the characteristics of digital materials that are critical to preserve, and the expectations and needs of our communities. When we focus our appraisal and acquisition decisions on matching our organizational and environmental resources to our community's needs, we can ensure the most value for our communities while maintaining the sustainability of our programs. For example, the acquisition decision for a research project's data could make separate appraisals of value and costs for the raw data, processed data, iterative analysis output, draft results, and final product. While it is tempting to preserve more just in case it may be useful, as one participant in the Creating Environmentally Sustainable Digital Preservation Workshop at the BitCurator Users Forum 2019 cautioned, we must be careful that our retention decisions for big data sets that rely on machines and machine learning for interpretation do not contribute to an environmental scenario where only the machines remain to learn from the data. Another benefit of engaging across job functions is that we can reappraise more easily. We can build reappraisal decisions into our interactions with digital materials throughout their life cycles to determine if our initial or previous appraisal decisions have stood the test of time. The second area we can integrate environmental sustainability principles is digital permanence. Our standard practice is to use technology to attempt to defy natural decay. Using replication and frequent fixity checking, among other strategies, we try to ensure the permanence of our digital materials. For some materials, this is certainly worth the effort, while for others, it is likely much more than required. To improve the sustainability of our practices and to better align our resources with those materials of high value to our communities, we should determine levels of acceptable loss for our digital materials. Nowitzki and Porter advocated for this approach with digital humanities projects in their presentation to Digital Humanities 2010, suggesting that we should allow the, quote, graceful degradation, unquote, of these projects. Benjamin Goldman expanded this to all digital materials in It's Not Easy Being Green, Digital Preservation in the Age of Climate Change, in which he argues that we should, quote, embrace acceptable levels of mutability, unquote, of our digital objects due to their lack of natural stability. We can build on these ideas by integrating determinations of acceptable loss into our appraisal and preservation practices. While our organizational context will determine how we create and enact levels of acceptable loss, there are criteria that are likely to be relevant for most organizations. We can evaluate which characteristics of the materials provide value to our communities and are important to preserve, whether the materials are born digital or digitized, and if the latter, whether the original item is at preservation risk, and other factors such as security requirements, uniqueness, anticipated levels of use, and anticipated consequences of loss or alteration. Then, once we have our levels of acceptable loss, we can align them with tiered preservation systems. As some organizations have already implemented, and more are moving toward, tiered preservation systems give us the flexibility to provide functionality that matches the level of preservation risk reduction that is most appropriate to certain digital materials based on our appraisal decisions. Implementing a variety of media types, varying the levels of fully redundant replication, and providing flexible fixity check frequencies allows us to mix and match to create distinct tiers. Curators and preservation specialists can then work together to assign and reevaluate over time the tiers that are most appropriate for certain risk profiles and that align with curators' decisions on acceptable loss. When we implement tiered preservation solutions, we can reduce our environmental impact as well as our financial costs while maintaining prudent risk mitigation levels and continuing to meet our community's needs. The third area for environmental sustainability integration into our practices is the availability of digital materials. As part of our tiered preservation solutions, we can incorporate storage types and functionality for our deliverable copies that still meet the needs of our communities while reducing the environmental impact. Standard practice is to have deliverable copies available almost instantaneously with a delivery request. Once a user selects an item for delivery, the only latency is that inherent in the system, such as load capacity and data transfer speeds. However, there are financial and environmental costs for this immediacy. To facilitate this speed, we need online media. This limits us to using spinning disk or solid-state drives and keeping them powered up continuously. Additionally, all of the drives accompanying hardware components that provide power, cooling, data transfer, and computational processing are always powered up as well. However, if we build in a slight delay, we can move to a model of nearline storage that uses media items that remain powered off until needed, but that are powered up automatically when requested. Using nearline storage would result in reduced energy use and would allow for different hardware configurations that reduce the overall number of components. We can also make our digitization of analog materials more sustainable. In place of increasing digitization simply to have more materials available digitally, we should instead shift to on-demand digitization by default. Experiences during the pandemic have highlighted the importance of on-demand digitization. Focusing our limiting organizational, financial, and environmental resources on digitizing materials for which we have current user demand should allow us to meet our users' digital delivery needs at least cost. Additionally, making on-demand digitization practices permanent and ensuring that users know about them and can easily request them will help us broaden our reach to users who cannot visit our physical spaces, even in normal times. Appraisal, permanence, availability. This is our core work. When we use Ehrenfeld's sustainability framework to reassess our practices, and meet user needs in new ways, we can integrate environmental sustainability as a third co-equal pillar of digital preservation practice, not as a burden, but as an enabling factor that complements financial and organizational sustainability. Conducting selective appraisal reduces the amount of digital materials that we acquire and preserve, lessening the ongoing costs and staff burden for maintenance and care. Determining levels of acceptable loss for different materials focuses our financial, technological, and staffing resources on those objects that have the most value for our community or are most at risk of loss. Moving to delayed delivery and on-demand digitization applies our resources not to delivery speed, but to achieving positive access and delivery outcomes for our community. When we engage more collaboratively across job functions, we can better balance our community's needs with the realities of financial and organizational resource scarcity and our work's environmental impact. Making environmental sustainability a core aspect of our work means that we can reduce the negative impact of our practices. We can improve our services to our communities while maintaining their rich, enduring cultural legacy. And we can be a part of the global solution that leads to true sustainability and ensures that our planet can continue to support an amazing diversity of life.